Some students were talking a little bit about confusion related to the cell membrane and how they function. So I thought I would go over the two assignments you had so you have something to review and look at in retrospect to completing the work. Or maybe you haven't finished it and this might help you. So question 1 on the cell membranes, how do they work? It says 2 key types of organic molecules make up most of the cell membrane. So we learned about organic molecules, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, and ATP. And a cell membrane is made of 2 layers. This is one layer, this is another layer. And the 2 layers are formed based on a special type of molecule. There's a special type of lipid called a phospholipid. So a phospholipid are these little molecules with a circle head and 2 tails coming off them. Fatty acid tails is what they're called. And that forms up the bulk of the cell membrane structure. However, embedded in those 2 layers of phospholipids, stretching around the cell, surrounding the cell, are these larger structures made of amino acids called proteins, in this case a membrane protein. And membrane proteins might be a lot of different, or serve a lot of different functions in cells, but one primary function for a lot of them is to be a doorway for molecules to go in and out. And so membrane proteins and phospholipids are the 2 key molecules we're talking about for number 1, and I've outlined them in this diagram here. Making a simple diagram or drawing, I just use the drawing tools and the Shapes app or Shapes tool on Kami and was able to put this together. And so I've labeled the 2 molecules that are necessary. Okay, what's the key difference between passive and active transport? The key difference is active transport requires ATP spent by the cell. ATP is the molecule that cells spend to do work. It's their spendable energy. And so when you get food digested and you break it down in your cells, glucose for example, you are trying to build up a store or supply of ATP that your cells can spend for energy. So passive transport means the molecules go in and out of the cell based on their own energy, not the cell's energy. And so one typical type of passive transport is called diffusion. And I'm showing you an example on this diagram. So these little pluses are maybe dissolved substances that need to get into or out of the cell. And what you see is that there's room to go through the doorway. And there's some of those pluses on the other side. Now you'll notice that on one side that's more concentrated down here, and over here it's more or less concentrated. Well, molecules, according to the law of diffusion, or how diffusion works, is that molecules move from areas of high concentration to areas of lower concentration. It's the same concept as when you fart. The smell, those smell molecules that you're smelling are concentrated. And sometimes it's very foul and burns your nose, but because those molecules are concentrated, they move to areas of the room that are less concentrated. And so the smell gets less and less noticeable till you can't detect it anymore. So diffusion happens by moving molecules from areas of high concentration to lower concentration. And the molecules are just doing that on their own. The cell doesn't spend energy. That's passive transport. So these pluses would move to the area of lower concentration over here through this membrane protein. All right, so active transport requires energy by the cell. Passive transport does not. Passive transport, that might be simple versus facilitated. Okay, so simple diffusion versus facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion means diffusion like these pluses here, going through the doorway, membrane protein doorway, to an area of lower concentration. That would be an example of facilitated diffusion. It's using one of the protein doorways. Some molecules, however, like oxygen gas, don't need a protein doorway. They're small enough, they're nonpolar molecules, and they can easily squeeze between phospholipids. And so if there's a higher concentration of oxygen here and a lower concentration of oxygen on this side of the membrane, the molecules will diffuse between the phospholipids to this side. And so my green arrow showing the oxygen coming in or across the membrane towards the bottom. So this would be an example of simple diffusion. So oxygen gas comes between the phospholipids from one side to the other where it's high concentrated, moving to an area of low concentration. All right, 5, talking about pumping and using active transport. So I said active transport requires spending of energy. So molecules moving across the membrane that have to go against the current, against the diffusion gradient. So here's a concentration gradient, high concentration here, low concentration here. The molecules, in order to go upstream, have to spend energy to paddle upstream. And so the only way to pump them upstream is to spend cellular energy. So this would be spending ATP in order to move it opposite the way it would want to go for diffusion. So if your cell is trying to take in glucose molecules, for example, the glucose might be more concentrated in the cell, but the cell still wants that glucose to used by the mitochondria to make ATP. And so it's going to spend a little ATP to get that glucose molecule in so that it can get 36 ATP built from that glucose. So that's an example of protein pumps and active transport in cells. And we'll talk about endo and exocytosis looking at the next diagram. All right, so you've got this diagram. Again, we have phospholipids, so 2 layers, and then membrane proteins. No different. So the process that's going on here, you have molecules going from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration. So it's going against the current, and it takes energy, ATP, to do that. So the process here is active transport, or protein pumps are at work. The molecule type here is a membrane protein. The hypertonic side is the more concentrated side. So hypertonic means more concentrated. So this would be the hypertonic side. The molecule being spent for energy is ATP. And the molecule type with the little head and 2 tails is a phospholipid. All right, process going on in this middle section. So we have high concentration over here and lower concentration here. And so the molecules are going through this membrane protein to an area of lower concentration. So diffusion is the process. Since it's going through a protein doorway, you could say facilitated diffusion. The molecule type that is allowing this doorway to happen, again, a membrane protein is being shown here. The molecule type in diagram C. So this is showing a cell membrane, but they have removed the membrane proteins. They're not showing those in this model. But they are showing the little molecules with heads and 2 tails. So these are phospholipids in 1 layer and a phospholipid layer here. And the process that's going on here is there is a vesicle being formed to transport. And so they call this vesicle-mediated transport And since the molecules for vesicle-mediated transport are coming into the cell to form the vesicle, then we call it endocytosis. So endocytosis is when the cell membrane wraps around and pinches off to form a vesicle containing the molecules that it wants to take in. And it takes, since it forms a vesicle, vesicle-mediated transport, and so that's what this is called, a vesicle containing whatever it took in. Because it's coming in, it's endocytosis. And it does require energy for the cell to do this. And so ATP is spent, so this is another type of active transport for taking in bigger molecules that can't fit through the protein doorways. All right, on this part of the diagram, we have areas of high concentration moving to areas of lower concentration. There's no energy being spent, so we're looking at diffusion. This membrane protein that is open all the time is called a channel protein. The whole process is, again, diffusion or passive transport. The hypotonic side means the less concentrated side, so the X would go here, and a star over the molecule using simple diffusion. If you look, the water molecules are going through or between the phospholipids, so they can diffuse between, and so the water molecules are going through simple diffusion. And so I think that pretty much covers it. See me if you have questions.